Hello, and welcome back to Movie Husbands. Today we're reviewing A Real Pain. Mismatched cousins David and Benji tour Poland to honor their grandmother. Their adventure becomes complicated as old tensions resurface while exploring their family history. A Real Pain is directed by Jesse Eisenberg and stars Jesse Eisenberg, Kieran Culkin, Jennifer Grey, and more. So Jeffrey, what do you think about A Real Pain?
So I'm sure Jesse Eisenberg doesn't need much of an introduction from me, but this is his second feature film as a writer-director. His first film I thought was fine, but very minor. This film feels like a considerable evolution in a lot of ways. Where his prior film was fun but juvenile and kind of undercooked, this film feels a lot more fully realized, like as if he arrived at a specific idea instead of saying, oh, maybe I should make a film one day. The film has a way of quickly and acutely establishing its characters. One thing I liked, and we could take these one by one as we talk about them, is that Jesse Eisenberg's character is the more nervous, conservative one who's afraid to get into trouble. Kieran's character is the hyper-emotional, morally forthright, more risk-taking person of the group. These are archetypes that the script really gives each character room to breathe and develops so much so that they are beyond these archetypes. In a lesser film, I think David would simply be neurotic and uptight, and Benji would be chaotic and unstable. And this film complicates both of those characterizations intelligently. Benji has real reasons why he gets in depressive states. His monologue about feeling odd in First Class is something that I'm sure we'll talk about, but that dovetails into his own pain as he searches for acknowledgement that's real and genuine. It's a real pain. And David's neuroticism is clearly rooted in his worry, right? Anyway, I don't want to get too deep too fast, but that's just a way of saying that I think the film is painting a picture with writing that's very sharp and much above average here.
Yeah, I completely agree. I have to say right up front, I really, really love this film. It is a Maddie movie.
Yeah, it is.
This is one of those films that in such a heartwarming way deals with these concepts of loss, grief, and generational trauma. As you mentioned, Jesse Eisenberg really draws such clear characters that you can almost easily pick out people in your own life that are like a Benji or like a David. But I love how this film then takes these characters and explores how they're dealing with their connection to their deceased loved ones, their faith, or even a defining event, in this case, the Holocaust. But most of this exploration takes place with these two characters, David and Benji, who are cousins, and they reunite for this trip to Poland, which is being financed by their deceased grandmother that recently passed away. During this trip, they join this tour group where they meet a band of characters who, underneath it all, are struggling with grief just as they are. But I think what makes this film stand out from a creative decision is that the film is so clearly defining its ethos up front. The message of this film is so purposefully and clearly put on display right from the get-go, with the first stop of the trip to this monument where the tour guide points to it and explains that while so much has happened in this place, so much suffering has occurred, this monument stands as a reminder to those who fought back against the Nazis. It's a message of resilience, and that while on this trip there's going to be a lot of discussion about pain, that is wise to keep this resilience in mind. Furthermore, not just that concept, but the film is also defining its physical ending. It is talking about the goal of this trip is to go see their grandmother's birth, like the home she grew up in Poland. With all these things in mind, we are really aware up front of the film's destination and its purpose. And thus, I think the film is guiding us in opposite conversation to the brutalist that we have that will be coming out either before or after this review. But the film is guiding us to care more about the journey than the final moments or just the destination, which I think is interesting compared to the purpose of the last film.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is definitely one of the funniest films of the year. Like, there's a tremendous wit to the screenplay. It's absolutely packed with jokes, and remarkably, most of the jokes are extensions of characterizations that have been prior established, whereas a more broad comedy would make a situation, it would develop a situation or a random occurrence, and those can be funny too, but almost all of the humor here simultaneously deepens the characterizations. As we're laughing, we're learning something new about the protagonist. So it has a dual function that adds to the entertainment factor of the film, but also our understanding of David and Benji as human beings.
And going from there, we could talk about them themselves. Benji is very outspoken and brash. He takes it upon himself to purposely break from social norms any chance he gets. He inserts himself into conversations. He asks striking personal questions, which sounds very familiar to somebody I know.
I identified a lot with Benji. I'm a little less unhinged. But...
Yeah, that is true. But as the film progresses, we really learn that these qualities are admirable to a huge degree, but also destructive to him at sometimes as well. David, on the other hand, is really much quite the opposite. His body moves and navigates places so stiffly, he is very buttoned up, and his emotions are so clearly buried that it's hard to tell what's really lurking under the surface in his performance. This is much in comparison to Benji's character, where you see one look on his face and you know some shit's going on deep down. And I think David's thoughts and emotions, and when he decides to express them, is very almost methodical and attached to social norms. He's thinking about other people and when it's proper to say something.
Yeah, completely. Benji's character embodies more this idea of generational pain that you were alluding to earlier. Particularly, there's a very affecting sequence on the train that I was talking about in my intro where he's pleading with everyone to feel something. Like, he can't help but feel the weight of history as he's on a first-class train to a concentration camp where his ancestors, not that long ago would have had a very different fate if they were on a train in that same country. We will talk about subjective experience in our Nickel Boys review too, imparting itself on generational history. I think this film explores that topic in a way that's more comedic and light. We may not feel the way that our ancestors felt, but sometimes visiting those sites can yield an involuntary response. I also think it can acknowledge a privilege. Like, I'm paraphrasing and maybe misremembering, but David's character says something about first-generation immigrants have a trade, second-generation immigrants become doctors and lawyers, and third-generation immigrants live in their parents' basement. It's played for laughs, and there's a truth to it, but our generation is so removed from the traumatic events of our ancestors that we no longer feel the need to excel in some extraordinary way to prove ourselves. So I thought that was an interesting way that the film looked at modern generational trauma.
I completely agree. And what's so great about Benji's character is he's getting everybody else to think about these things as well. Of course, while later in the film it becomes a slight hindrance to the experience they're all having, it's his engagement early in the film that gets this group to, converse about these topics. There's this first introduction to this little band of characters that is coming along on this trip. One guy is a convert to Judaism, so he doesn't really have any youth based in the religion. Then we have a woman who's played by Jennifer Grey. She almost becomes more of a conversational piece between Benji. They strike up a little bit of a relationship.
Can I say that their relationship starts by Benji saying, "Hey, why are you walking alone? Are you like a loser or something?"
That's so great. But it's his ability to cut through the stupid social crap and get to know somebody, where it could take such a long time during this trip to make it happen. He's like, no, we're starting now. Where he engages with this character named Aloj, the black man that converted to Judaism. He is almost like getting up in his face, like he's leaning in. He's very interested, inserting himself a little bit too much. He's talking over him. While it yields a positive result, you can't help but feel like, oh, maybe he's going a little bit too hard.
Yeah, like he's really oddly interested in how he survived the Rwandan genocide. It's a little discomforting, but I do think it comes from a good place. He's just not totally great at maybe reading those. Actually, no, I take that back. He is good at reading social cues and social reactions. He just purposely disavows himself from them. But the way that he thinks, and this is a minor spoiler, I don't think this is anything crazy, but it does happen late in the film. The way that he thinks clearly has an effect on the group, because when the group visits a concentration camp late in the film, it's completely silent. So it's almost as if they're all finally feeling what Benji was expressing on the train. Like, I haven't been to a concentration camp, and I can't imagine what it feels like as a Jewish person to visit a concentration camp, but I have been in places where I felt the weight in history in those moments. It's such an overpowering moment that sometimes all you can really do is stare in silence. This film encapsulated that moment so well, but it also gave credence to Benji's freak out on the train earlier in the film. And after they visit the concentration camp, all he can do on the way home is cry.
This actually came up in the Q&A after the film. Jesse Eisenberg was talking about, also Jennifer Grey, how she had never been to a concentration camp before. And I'm not necessarily sure Kieran Culkin had either. I think that was the impression I got.
Yeah.
They had blocked this scene out in advance so that when they got to the concentration camp, they could just film the scenes. Jennifer Grey was discussing how she had gone up and saw the shoes, how that had such an impact on her physically and emotionally. Jesse Eisenberg was talking about how that in a way, their first experience being that moment really benefited the film because it was so authentic. I think that really added a lot to the film. So it was a nice little point to learn in the Q&A.
Okay, so we're going to go to more spoiler territory with the film. So if you have not seen A Real Pain, please come back after you have seen it, unless for some reason you don't care about being spoiled. But we're going to talk about some specific interpretations in the latter half of the film. This is a common thing, I think, in independent comedies, but I really like how information is slowly doled out throughout the film. It plays with your perceptions of characters, and I think that this film chooses when to reveal certain information in ways that it's most impactful. So for instance, Benji, first we learn in a group meeting why they are there in the first place is because their grandmother died, and Benji was very close with her, and he has this tearful, reflective moment early in the film. So that's the first kernel of information we get as to why Benji's life seems a little out of sorts. Later in the film, we get another very large kernel that we find out Benji had tried to take his own life months prior, and that opens up a whole other chapter of Benji and David's relationship and sort of explains why they have this odd relationship that you can tell that they're very close and they know a lot about each other, but something seems a little bit off. So it does lead to some really good conversations and heart-to-hearts as the film goes on, but I like the way that it just quietly doles out information when we need to know it for maximum impact.
Yeah, and that couldn't be more apparent. At one point, Benji had literally turned to David and told him, you used to cry.
Yeah.
Like, you used to wear your emotions on your sleeve. And here we have David is maybe not the same person he knew from back in childhood, and they've changed a little bit. By the end of the film, you could tell they're not going to change as people, but they've had little influences on each other. I would say that David actually learns to be a little bit more probing and involved, and Benji learns a little bit about emotional stability and maybe the aspects of David's life that could help him.
Yeah, so I want to talk about the end of the film, actually. Obviously, some hearts to hearts happens. They're very touching. They're emotional. They're very well acted, especially by Kieran Culkin, who I really hope gets an Oscar nomination. At the very end of the film, we see David return to his wife and kids. Benji remains in the airport in much the same way we found him in the beginning of the film. And it ends with a close-up on his face. And we had a mini debate about the film because you said you thought it ended sadly, and I thought it ended happily. Well, not happily, but that he would be okay because he said he would be okay.
Yeah.
But maybe something on his face says otherwise. I wasn't like staring at his face as the movie ended because it ends with that close-up on his face, but it was more like I was getting the general vibe.
It's interesting because he says he's going to be okay, and then we have that final shot. And it's something about the look in his eye. He's looking around him. He seems actually more insecure. He's not turning around and saying anything to the people next to him. It seems almost opposite of what I came to know of him throughout the entirety of the film.
Interesting.
But there is this little glimmer. There's a very particular movement he makes right at the end before it cuts to black. He turns his head to the side and his face slowly goes into maybe like a little smirk, like a little smile. That's not quite a smile. Well, it's like it cuts out before it turns into what it's going to be. It's really crazy. That's the way I interpret it. So I really want to go back and rewatch this. The qualities that I would consider make him an extrovert are actually things that might be masking other parts of him, like his insecurities and stuff. So I don't know. I got a little bit of that impression at the end.
It's interesting because you could treat the film as a Rorschach test and say how you feel about humanity is what the film is showing you, but we have opposite interpretations of how we normally feel about humanity. Like usually I see a film and I'm like, these people are screwed. They're never going to figure it out. And you see more of the hope in things. So it's funny that we read this a little bit differently, but knowing what you had said and describing it in detail, what happened on his face, I'm anxious to revisit it and see if I can then come to that interpretation.
I will say you can't expect a week or two. I don't remember how long the trip is. It's like 2 weeks or something like that. You can't expect 2 weeks of a trip to change an entire person and to make things better.
No, but I think it's more like, does he now have the tools or those little kernels that would eventually lead to change?
And I think there are moments in the film that allude to that. There's one in particular where as they're breaking from the group and they're saying their goodbyes, the tour guide specifically comes up to him and makes a point to thank him for bringing up how he could have changed his tour, that nobody has given him advice of how to make the tour better. When they went to a grave site, he came up with the idea of putting all these rocks on one of the mantles to honor the person that was buried there and just let them know that they're not being forgotten. Probably wouldn't have happened if it wasn't for Benji.
So are you ready to go to grades?
I am ready to go to grades. I give the film an A-. I really, really enjoyed it. I would say it's one of my favorite films of the year so far. It was laugh out loud funny. I know we talked about the humor briefly, but our audience was laughing so hard.
Yeah.
I would say we had saw Nora and people were laughing in that film too.
I think that's the only film that people laughed more in.
And most of that really is attributed to Kieran Culkin in this film. I thought he was absolutely brilliant. But speaking of humor, not only was the film funny, but the Q&A that we saw was absolutely hilarious.
Which is now on YouTube, actually.
Oh.
Yeah, so if you go to Film at Lincoln Center, the New York Film Festival Q&A with Jesse Eisenberg and everybody from the cast is hilarious. And the one with Emma Stone, because there's 2 on there. Emma Stone is not on the other one.
Oh, no? Oh, yeah,
so
you need Emma Stone.
The one with Emma Stone is very, very funny.
Yeah, it was great. Jesse Eisenberg is filming in Budapest, so he was on camera. Probably had to be like 2 or 3 a.m. his time.
Yeah.
So thank you for doing that, Jesse Eisenberg. He was on the camera. It was his birthday as well. It was really cute. They were just like bantering. They were being very forthright and open about the process of making the movie. How like Kieran Culkin wanted to drop out of the film and how she got him back in. It was just so lighthearted and fun and real. So I don't know. It was super authentic and it was full of laughs. I really recommend watching it.
Yeah, so I give the film a B+. I thought it was mostly lovely. It was a very comforting film. So the kind of warm, like Sundance adjacent indie film, like indie dramedy that used to be like a dime a dozen in the early 2000s that we don't see a lot anymore. It reminded me a lot of those films. You laugh quite a bit, but you also maybe get some insight into the human condition. There's just such good character building in this film, and I think very sharp writing. I would love to see this get a script nomination too. We'll see how that goes further into Oscar season, but I think it's just a lovely film, and I think it's a film that many, many different kinds of people can enjoy.
All right, and that's it for our review of A Real Pain. A Real Pain will be in theaters on November 1st, so go check it out. Let us know in the comments, what did you think about this film? As always, thank you guys for watching, and we'll see you next time.